Before we begin, if you enjoy true farm stories about unusual ideas, forgotten animals, and hardworking people who refuse to quit, make sure to subscribe to N97 Quiet Farmer. And while you listen, I'd love to hear your answer to this question. Have you ever seen something everyone considered worthless become the key to success? Let us know in the comments below. By late summer, nearly every potato field across the valley looked defeated. Rows that had once stood green and healthy now resembled skeletons. Leaves hung shredded from their stems. Entire harvests seemed doomed. Men who had spent months tending their crops could do little but stare at the damage. Yet one field remained untouched, behind a long willow fence at the far end of the valley. 63 nearly blind ducks wandered quietly between rows of potatoes, so green they looked almost unreal. People stopped talking when they saw it. The same neighbors who had laughed all spring now stood silently near the fence, studying a sight they could hardly explain. Months earlier, before anyone imagined what was coming, Wesley Carr had spoken a simple truth over supper. A thing doesn't have to look impressive to be valuable. It only needs to do one job better than anyone expects. Across the table, his wife Junie smiled. She believed that completely. Most people in the valley did not. Out here, usefulness mattered. Beauty didn't, and sometimes the most useful things arrived, wearing the strangest faces. The Carr farm sat on 40 difficult acres at the cold edge of the valley. The previous owner had nearly gone broke trying to make a living there. The land was rocky. The creek ran low during dry years. The barn leaned slightly to one side, but Wesley and Junie had managed to buy it with the last of Wesley's lumber camp wages and every dollar Junie had saved from sewing work. It wasn't much, yet it was theirs, and they intended to build a future from it. Many of their neighbors had farmed successfully for decades. Those older farmers watched the young couple with polite amusement. Most expected them to fail. Among them stood Garrett Pruitt, owner of the largest potato operation in the valley. Pruitt wasn't cruel. He simply believed experience made him right about nearly everything. During their first winter, Wesley asked him for advice. Pruitt's answer was straightforward. Plant potatoes. Don't get fancy. So they did. 3 acres, straight rows, careful spacing, no experiments. A young farm needed dependable income, more than risky dreams. But Junie noticed things other people overlooked. She had grown up helping a father who kept bees and studied nature closely. Where others saw fields, Junie saw details. She noticed insects crossing leaves. She noticed birds arriving at certain times of day. She noticed changes in the soil. She noticed patterns. Wesley often joked that she could find a secret hiding inside a handful of dirt. What made them work so well together was trust. Wesley provided patience and steady labor. Junie provided observation. Together, they were building something promising, but they had almost no room for mistakes. One failed harvest could destroy everything they had worked for. So when Junie began examining potato leaves closely one May morning, she wasn't simply being curious. She was protecting their future. Beneath several leaves, she discovered clusters of tiny orange eggs. The sight immediately bothered her. Only days later, troubling news spread across the county. A farm east of the valley had suffered a devastating infestation the previous season. Striped potato beetles, thousands of them. The insects had stripped entire fields bare in only weeks. The farmer lost nearly everything. Now similar eggs were appearing throughout the region. No one had found a reliable solution. Around the same time, another piece of information appeared on a notice board outside the feed store. A failed duck farm at the far edge of the valley was being forced into liquidation. The owner needed to sell his flock. The advertisement included one unusual detail. Most of the ducks were nearly blind, and eye disease had spread through the flock years earlier. Few people wanted them. 63 ducks, almost worthless. Junie stood reading the notice. Then she thought about the beetle eggs. Then she looked at the notice again. Something clicked. That evening, she brought the idea to Wesley. Ducks, she said. Wesley stared. Ducks, blind ducks. His expression made it clear exactly what he thought of the idea. And honestly, what would you have thought at that moment? Would you have bought 63 nearly blind ducks to save your farm? Or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments. Wesley slowly turned his coffee cup. We'd have to feed them all summer. Junie pulled a potato leaf from her apron. The orange eggs glowed under the lamp. You know what hatches from these? He nodded. Both understood the danger. Ducks eat beetles, Junie continued. They eat eggs, They eat larvae. They eat insects all day. Wesley rubbed his chin. But these ducks are blind, mostly blind. They'll get lost. Maybe. They'll wander. Not if we give them nowhere to wander. That answer caught his attention. Junie explained her reasoning. A healthy duck could roam everywhere. A blind duck preferred staying close to familiar ground. If she could keep the birds confined exactly where the beetles appeared, they might become perfect insect hunters. The more she explained, the more the idea began making sense, at least on paper. Still, Wesley knew what would happen next. The valley would laugh. Everyone would think they had lost their minds. Junie simply shrugged. They already thought we were crazy for buying this farm. That wasn't much comfort, but it was true. Then she leaned forward. If those beetles hatch and we do nothing, we lose the crop. She paused. I'd rather look foolish and save the farm than look sensible and lose everything. For a long moment, Wesley studied the leaf. Then he studied his wife. Finally, he nodded. All right. The next morning, they drove to the failed duck farm. The birds looked even worse than expected. Many bumped into fence posts. Several stumbled over feed buckets. Some seemed completely dependent on sound rather than sight. The owner appeared embarrassed to even show them. Nobody wanted these ducks. Nobody except Junie. By afternoon, 63. Nearly blind ducks were riding home in wooden crates, and before the wagon even reached their property, neighbors had already begun talking. The strangest experiment in the valley had officially begun. What nobody realized was that the real test hadn't arrived yet. The beetles were still coming, and soon the entire valley would discover whether the cars were fools or visionaries. Before we continue, tell me this. Have you ever had an idea everyone laughed at before it succeeded? I'd genuinely love to read your story in the comments. The first challenge wasn't the beetles. It was building a system that could turn 63 nearly blind ducks into workers. Junie spent 2 nights awake, replaying the problem in her mind. A blind duck in an open field was almost useless, but a blind duck in a narrow space, surrounded by food and protected from distractions, might become something entirely different. The answer wasn't changing the ducks. The answer was changing their environment. One morning, she walked the potato rows with Wesley and explained her plan. We don't give them the whole field. Wesley listened. We give them lanes, narrow corridors, just wide enough for a duck, just long enough to guide them directly along the potato plants. The birds wouldn't need to see. They would only need to keep moving forward. Wesley immediately understood. The carpenter in him began measuring distances before Junie even finished speaking. Money was scarce. Buying lumber wasn't an option, so they used whatever they could find. Old boards behind the barn, willow branches cut from the creek, rusting barrel hoops, anything useful. Every morning before sunrise they worked. Every evening after dark they worked. Slowly the field transformed. Long narrow lanes appeared between the rows. Willow walls stretched across the soil. Little gates connected one section to another. From a distance, the entire thing looked absurd, less like a farm and more like a giant maze built by a child. Neighbors passing by slowed their wagons to stare. Some laughed immediately. Others simply shook their heads, but Junie ignored them. She focused on details. Water pans were buried level with the ground so the ducks could drink without wandering. Drainage channels directed rainwater away from the lanes. Each section connected smoothly to the next. Everything served a purpose. Nothing existed by accident. Finally, the day arrived. The ducks were released, and for one terrifying hour, everything seemed to go wrong. Birds bumped into walls. Several sat down and refused to move. Others turned in circles. One particularly stubborn duck simply stood still and quacked at nothing. Wesley folded his arms. I didn't say I told you so. But Junie knew exactly what he was thinking. Still, she wasn't ready to panic. Animals needed time to learn. Slowly, she scattered grain ahead of them. A few ducks followed the sound. Others followed the smell. One by one, bills lowered towards the ground. One by one, they began moving forward, searching, snuffling, exploring. By sunset, something remarkable had happened. The ducks had stopped fighting the lanes. 3 days later, they moved through them confidently. They found water on their own. They followed familiar paths. They settled into routines. The strange system was beginning to work. Standing at the edge of the field one evening, Junie watched 63 nearly blind ducks moving steadily between the potato rows. It looked ridiculous, completely ridiculous. And yet, it also looked strangely efficient, like a machine finally finding its rhythm. The laughter began almost immediately. The first major visitor was a neighbor named Hollis. He rode past on horseback, stopped, stared for nearly 5 minutes, then burst out laughing. Before sunset, he had already told half the valley. The next day, people started showing up, 2 at a time. 3 at a time. Entire families sometimes. Everyone wanted to see the famous duck maze. Children pointed. Men joked. Women whispered. And through it all, The ducks kept working. If you've ever tried something new while everyone around you thought it was ridiculous, you probably understand exactly how Junie felt. Tell me honestly, would you have ignored the criticism, or would you have given up? Garrett Pruitt eventually arrived as well. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh openly. That almost made it worse. He stood beside the fence studying the lanes, studying the ducks, studying Junie. Finally he spoke. You spent money on blind ducks. Junie smiled slightly. Not much money. And all this work, he gestured toward the maze. All this effort for birds that can't even see properly. Junie remained calm. We'll know by August. Pruitt sighed. There are proper ways to farm potatoes. His voice carried this confidence of a man accustomed to being correct. Dust the fields, pick the beetles by hand, follow proven methods. Then he looked around the maze. This isn't farming. It's a circus. The word spread quickly. Within days, everyone was calling the Carr property the circus farm. The nickname stuck, and surprisingly, that hurt more than Junie expected. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes from being laughed at by an entire community, especially when you're risking everything. Some nights she lay awake wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. She replayed the logic repeatedly. Beetles eat potatoes. Ducks eat beetles. The ducks stay where the beetles hatch. The system should work. The reasoning was sound. Yet being right and feeling confident are not always the same thing. Meanwhile, Wesley handled things differently. He worked. When people laughed, he repaired fences. When people mocked the ducks, he cleaned water pans. When people predicted failure, he simply worked harder. But Junie noticed the tension. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw the exhaustion building. Neither of them enjoyed being the valley's joke. Still, they continued. Day after day, morning after morning. The ducks became healthier. Their feathers improved. Their movements grew more confident. They learned whistles. They learned feeding times. Most surprisingly, they began laying eggs. Soon there were more eggs than Wesley and Junie could eat. Junie sold the extras in town. The income wasn't huge, but it mattered. For the first time, the ducks were contributing to the farm. Not much, but enough to encourage hope. Yet the real test still hadn't arrived. Every morning, Junie continued turning over potato leaves. Every morning, she checked the orange egg clusters. Every morning, they seemed darker, closer, ready. The entire valley waited. Most expected disaster. Some secretly hoped for it. And every day, Junie counted closer to the moment of truth. Then, one warm morning, it happened. The eggs hatched. Thousands of tiny larvae appeared almost overnight. Leaves that had looked healthy the day before suddenly crawled with life. The invasion had begun. Across the valley, panic spread quickly. Farmers watched helplessly as beetles advanced through their fields. Plants began disappearing. Entire rows suffered damage within days. The nightmare everyone feared had arrived. But inside the Carr field, something different was happening. The ducks were already working. Bills moved constantly across the soil, larvae crawling near the base of the plants disappeared. Eggs vanished. Young beetles vanished. Anything small enough to reach became food. Junie stood at the edge of the field and watched. One duck cleared several feet of row in minutes. Another worked through a cluster of larvae without slowing down. Everywhere she looked, the ducks were hunting. For the first time all summer, hope felt real. The plan wasn't merely surviving. It was working, at least for now, because the beetles weren't finished yet, and the hardest part of the battle was still ahead. For several days, everything seemed to confirm Junie's theory. The ducks worked tirelessly. Larvae disappeared. Lower leaves remained healthy, while neighboring fields showed increasing damage. The Carr farm continued holding its ground. Then, reality reminded them that nature rarely gives easy victories. The first problem was simple mathematics. There were far more beetles than Junie had anticipated. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Every day new larvae emerged. The ducks could easily reach insects near the ground, but beetles feeding higher on the plants remained untouched. The battle wasn't being lost, but it wasn't being won quickly enough either. Junie realized they needed another solution, so she and Wesley added themselves to the system. Every afternoon they walked the rows together, bending under the summer heat, shaking potato plants, knocking larvae from upper leaves down to the soil where the ducks could reach them. Hour after hour, day after day, the work was exhausting. By evening, their backs ached. Their hands cramped. Their clothes were soaked with sweat. Yet every morning they returned to the field and did it again, because there was no alternative. If they stopped, the beetles would win. Then came the rain. Heavy rain. The kind that turns farm roads into mud and washes away weeks of careful planning. Water filled the lanes. Drainage ditches overflowed, several willow walls collapsed, one entire section of fencing gave way during a storm. 3 ducks escaped into the open field, unable to see properly. They wandered toward the creek. Wesley spent nearly an hour searching for them in pouring rain. When he finally returned, carrying the frightened birds, he was soaked from head to toe. That night, neither of them slept much. The experiment was working, but it was fragile. One storm, one broken fence, one mistake, everything could disappear. And while they struggled against insects and weather, another problem was quietly growing: the valley itself. At first people laughed, now they watched. The laughter became nervous, because something uncomfortable was becoming obvious. The car field was surviving, other fields were not. The same men who had mocked the ducks now watched their own crops deteriorate. Every green leaf on the car farm became evidence that someone else had been right, and someone else had been wrong. Garrett Pruitt felt that more than anyone. His seed potatoes had filled half the county. His advice had guided most of the valley. And now those same farmers were watching their crops disappear, while the circus farm remained green. Pruitt never confronted Wesley directly. Instead, he talked at the feed store, at the mill, during county meetings, always calmly, always reasonably, always planting doubt. Their luck won't last. The ducks can't keep up forever. They've just gotten fortunate. At first, those comments caused little concern. Then the rumors changed. Suddenly, people weren't discussing potatoes anymore. They were discussing the ducks. Someone claimed the birds were being mistreated. Someone claimed blind animals shouldn't be used that way. Someone suggested the cars were exploiting helpless creatures. The stories spread quickly, faster than truth ever does. One afternoon, Junie heard 2 women discussing it in town. Neither had ever visited the farm. Neither had seen the ducks, yet both spoke with complete certainty. Junie returned home feeling sick, because she understood something important. Saving the crop might not be enough. They could win the harvest and still lose their reputation. The pressure followed them everywhere, into the house, into their sleep, into their marriage. One evening, after an especially difficult day, Wesley finally spoke. They sat quietly at supper. Neither had much appetite. Finally, he set down his fork. "Maybe we should stop." Junie looked up. "Stop what?" "The experiment." The words hung heavily between them. "We could sell the ducks." "Wesley, we've proven something." "Not yet. We're exhausted." His voice remained calm. That somehow made it harder to hear. "We're fighting bugs. We're fighting weather. We're fighting rumors. We're fighting everyone." He rubbed his eyes. "I'm tired." "Junie." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Junie's voice softened. "You think I'm wrong?" "No." The answer came immediately. "No. That's the problem." He looked directly at her. "I think you might be right. But right now, being right feels expensive." That hit harder than any insult from the valley, because it was honest. Junie sat silently. Had she become stubborn? Was she pushing forward because the idea worked, or because she wanted to prove everyone else wrong? The question bothered her. Finally, she stood. "Come with me." They carried a lantern into the darkness. Together they walked into the field. Junie stopped beside a row and turned over several leaves. "Look." Wesley studied them. The lower sections of the plants were clean, almost completely clean. No larvae, no eggs, nothing. The ducks did that. She moved farther down the row. More clean leaves, more healthy plants. The upper leaves are still fighting, but look at the progress. For several minutes, Wesley examined plant after plant. Slowly, he began seeing what Junie saw. The infestation wasn't growing. It was shrinking, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Finally, he nodded. 10 more days. Junie smiled. 10 more days. The argument ended right there among the potato rows. Not because the problems disappeared, but because they remembered they were on the same side. And sometimes that's enough. The next 8 days were the hardest of the entire summer. Then disaster struck. A fox found the duck pen. Before sunrise, Junie discovered chaos. The gate hung broken. The flock had scattered. Terrified ducks wandered everywhere. Several sections of lane fencing had been trampled flat. Months of work lay destroyed. Junie stared at the damage, then sat down in the mud. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't speak. They were so close. Only 2 days remained. 2 days, after everything they had endured. Failure had arrived at the doorstep. Wesley sat beside her. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't offer speeches. He simply wrapped an arm around her shoulders and waited. Eventually, Junie wiped away her tears. Then she looked at the broken lanes, really looked, and suddenly she saw something. The lanes had never been the secret. The ducks were. The lanes only taught them where to work. Now the ducks already knew. Slowly she stood. "We're not rebuilding." Wesley blinked. "What?" "We don't need the lanes anymore." The idea sounded impossible, yet the more she considered it, the more certain she became. The ducks knew the whistle. They knew the rows. They knew the routine. The maze had taught them. Now they could work without it. That morning, they gathered the flock using the same whistle Junie had used all summer. One by one, the ducks returned. Then another idea emerged. Instead of dividing the birds into lanes, they would move them as a group, like shepherds moving sheep. All day, Wesley and Junie walked behind the flock carrying long willow switches, guiding, whistling, directing. The ducks moved together through the rows. 63 hungry bills, searching every inch of soil. Where beetles appeared heavily, they concentrated the flock. Where larvae remained on leaves, Wesley shook them loose. The birds consumed them immediately. What began as a desperate emergency became an improvement. The system worked faster than before, more efficiently, more flexibly. The fox had destroyed the maze, but the ducks no longer needed it. By the evening of the 10th day, Junie completed one final inspection. Row after row, plant after plant, leaf after leaf. Nothing. No larvae, no eggs, no beetles. The infestation was finished, and the potatoes stood healthy. 3 entire acres, green, strong, alive. Meanwhile, fields across the valley had been devastated. The truth became impossible to ignore. The real turning point arrived during the county fair. Farmers gathered to discuss the disaster. Every conversation eventually returned to beetles, lost harvests, failed treatments, ruined fields. Then someone mentioned the Carr farm, the circus farm, the farm with the blind ducks. At first, few believed it, so they rode out to see for themselves. Dozens of farmers arrived that afternoon. When they reached the willow fence, silence fell. The evidence stood directly in front of them. Healthy potatoes, healthy ducks, healthy profits, the only untouched field in the valley. Finally, Garrett Pruitt stepped forward. The crowd watched carefully. Junie expected another argument. Instead, he removed his hat, and to his credit, he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I owe you an apology." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Pruitt continued, "I called this place a circus. I said your idea wouldn't work. I said those birds were being mistreated." He looked toward the ducks. Fat, healthy, content. Then toward the field, green from one end to the other. "I was wrong." Every word echoed across the crowd. "You saw something the rest of us missed." For the first time all summer, nobody laughed. The following year, farmers throughout the valley copied the system. Many bought ducks, many built lanes, many asked Junie for advice, and she shared everything freely, because she remembered what her father taught her. Knowledge becomes more valuable when it is shared. That winter, the Carrs paid off debts, improved their farm, bought better lumber, strengthened the duck pens, and prepared for the future. As for the 63 nearly blind ducks nobody wanted, they became local legends, the strangest workers the valley had ever seen, and perhaps the most effective. Years later, while teaching a young neighbor how the system worked, Junie watched the ducks moving confidently through fresh green rows. The boy frowned. "They can barely see." Junie smiled. "No, they can't." Then she repeated the lesson that changed everything. A thing doesn't have to be impressive to be valuable. It only has to do one thing better than anyone expects. And if this story reminded you that wisdom often hides in unexpected places, please leave a comment below and tell us what part surprised you most. Thank you for spending time with us here at N97 Quiet Farmer. And if you enjoy stories about quiet determination, overlooked ideas, and the people who refuse to give up, subscribe to N97 Quiet Farmer and join us for the next story.